Confucianism with their primal Shinto studies. And they were masters of all these things. So they learned Chinese, they learned all the complexities of Confucian thought. Plus, they then married it to Shinto thought. And when they first discovered Western thought, when people started turning up in Japan who were teaching Christianity and science and so on, some of them have now adopted a more scientific cosmology as well, which they've integrated into Shintoism. So that if you're a Shintoist intellectual now in Japan, you'll also know everything there is about the periodic table and the elements and the behaviour of quarks and all that stuff, because they're really good at science. So, fascinating stuff. And the other sacred jewel of Shintoism is the Magatama. It looks like a little seahorse shape, or a human embryo even. And it's what life looks like. It's the life force. It has a slight kink. It's not like a total spiral. And we begin as that little tiny embryo in our mother's womb. And when the male and the female come together, the sperm and the egg, and it comes out as this little embryo. And to the Japanese, that's holy, that's sacred. So they have this jewel in their temple. These three jewels are their regalia, if you want. And their ideal is peace, but they also have the way of the warrior, the samurai. The Japanese warrior will combat, if necessary, against evil and ignorance. I mean, ideally with education and teaching, but if necessary, then with combat. And so they train deeply in the martial arts and in the samurai way of the warrior. The best samurai never has to raise their sword. They just convince the evil guy to stop being evil, like a good teacher. But as a backup, it's good to have a strong sword. And sometimes they've taken that to excess. During the Japanese imperialist era of the 1930s and 40s, obviously they tried to do a big empire across the Pacific and attacked Hawaii and killed lots of people and were quite cruel to the captors they had. And there was sort of arrogance crept into the Japanese soul at that point. I've known people whose fathers were imprisoned in Japanese concentration camps in the war, and they were not treated very well. They did some, horrible torture type things. I don't regard that as actual Shinto thought. I think that was a perversion of Shintoism. Just as I don't regard Putin's war on Ukraine as authentic Orthodox Christianity. It's a perversion of it. And that can happen to all these religions, sadly. And some mainstream Shintoists did speak out against the stupidity of World War II and this Japanese imperialist adventure, which was quite cruel to people where they conquered in China and Korea places. Anyway, that's Shintoism. And as a result of that, when the Americans conquered Japan and occupied it, they abolished Shinto knowledge being taught in schools in Japan. So if you're studying in a Japanese school, you won't learn about this stuff. I think that's going a bit too far, and I don't think that's right. Myself personally, because as a religious studies teacher, I think everyone should learn about them all. Properly, honestly, and truthfully. And so for the Japanese school kid, they should be able to learn about Shintoism, just as in Europe they can learn about Christianity or Buddhism or any other tradition. I think every child growing up on planet Earth should have access to this periodic table, and they could learn about them all, because I believe in a global citizenship and a global education entitlement. Okay, now how does that relate to, that's the Shinto one, how do we relate that to Orthodox Judaism? Well, that's a great question. I've been studying Orthodox Judaism today, actually, for a book I'm writing. And I discovered there's a place in the south of France near Avignon called Carpentras, which is a town which has the oldest synagogue in France, and it's still going. It was founded in about 1200. And it has a small but significant Jewish community that's been living there ever since. And I'm determined to go and visit it this summer because it's near Avignon. And I want to go to Avignon. And also, interestingly, there's like a stone relief there in the library, which is a very big library founded by a bishop of Carpentras, which I'm going to go and hang out in this summer. And they found in that village of Carpentras, which is now a little town, the oldest Phoenician kind of sculptured bas relief, they're called, showing it's got Phoenician writing at the bottom, but it's got a scene taken from the journey of the soul into the afterlife in ancient Egyptian religion. It shows Osiris and a soul coming before Osiris saying, please don't sentence me to hell, I've been a good soul, I've been good to everybody, I didn't lie and cheat and steal, you know. And then there's writing underneath in a Semitic language, probably Phoenician or possibly Canaanite, which is a kind of poem to the ancient Egyptian gods, Osiris and so on. And scholars are still debating, like, how did it get there? What's it doing in Carpentras in southern France? Was it left there by some wandering Phoenician sailors? What's going on here? You know, I'm going to go and find out. But what's interesting is it's the oldest such thing ever found in, you know, in France, and possibly even more broadly. And it shows us that what we call Judaism evolved out of indigenous Semitic religious practices of the people of the region of Canaan. Phoenicia was the name given to the coastal people. Canaan was the inland. Right now, their language, Phoenician or Canaanite, is ancestral to Hebrew. So really, the Hebrews are kind of a Canaanite tribe. And the languages are both, they're dialects of what's called West Semitic language. Closely related is Aramaic, which was another sort of regional variation of this West Semitic dialect. And so when scholars find old Semitic, you know, alphabetic carvings on rocks and stuff, which they found in the Sinai, in the desert and elsewhere, there's a thing called the Moabite stone, which is an old archaeological example of this. They can say, oh yeah, that's ancestral to the Hebrews, you know. Now what's interesting is, in the beginning, all those people worshipped a kind of nature religion, just like Shintoism or Druidry. They had a plurality of deities. They had gods and goddesses in the oldest substrata of Semitic religion. They worshipped trees and volcanoes and mountains, and you know, they were fond of life. They were life affirming, just like the Shintoists or the Druids are. So we know that to be the ancestral core religion of the ancestors of the Hebrews, right? So where did this idea of the later, what we call Judaism, come, that there's only one God, right, who hates all the other gods? And that was written down in the Bible much later, that concept, this radical monotheism. You know, well, that came much later, it evolved, and I think we can say that there were political, social, and historical reasons for that, because what we call the Jewish people centralized their kingdom in Jerusalem. They said, here's the capital, there's the king, and what the priests in that temple say, that's the truth. What they write down, that's the truth. Everything else is a heresy. Now this is an old trick. It's as old as human nature. You know, it goes back to, like Freud would say, it goes back to monkeys in the forest trying to, like, be the top monkey and killing all the other monkeys. You know, and it's just a sort of animal instinct to take control and be in charge and say, we're the only temple. Our God is the only God. But it's theologically not a consistent position to take if you look at all the religions as a whole. So that's what I call vulgar monotheism. Judaism deteriorated for socio-political reasons and economic reasons. Like, why would you bother to go to Jerusalem and pay your sin tax if there was a temple down the road to the goddess and you could pay less there? You wouldn't bother to go to Jerusalem. It's only if the myth that the only God is the God of Jerusalem, so you've got to come here and pay here, that you would then neglect to go to your local goddess temple, which would be in the woods somewhere, and you could just get away with a tenth of the tithe, and you wouldn't have to go on the long journey. So no, it was a kind of it was a bit of a scam actually, saying ours is the only God, ours is the only temple. You can only come here and worship, and all the others are devils. Which is where they took the idea, because that became the extreme form of it. So that's what I call vulgar monotheism. However, I believe there's also something I call esoteric monotheism, which I think that some of the founders that are honoured in the Jewish tradition and in the other monotheistic traditions, namely Christianity and Islam, especially Abraham, I think they had an experience of what I call esoteric monotheism. Because they were wandering about in the region of the Holy Land, and Abraham was from Sanlerfa, which is in Mesopotamia, but not the of the Chaldees. It's higher up. Tragically, just where the huge earthquake has hit, on the frontier of Turkey and Syria. Abraham came from round there. And even the Bible says he ends up there at Haran and places. Those are all in the Bible as his homeland, and that's where the earthquakes just hit, tragically. So Abraham was wandering about, and I think he realised inwardly, he came to what I call the meta-Mahayana position, that because he spent time in Egypt, he wandered about Canaan, he was from Mesopotamia, they all spoke different languages, had different temples, different gods and goddesses. The one in his home area, Haran, was dedicated to the moon god, Sin. And probably his father was a priest of Sin in the temple of the moon god. And Abraham, deep down, still believed in Sin. He just said, as he walked about, went to Egypt, say, he came to the view that there is a unity underlying all these different deities. You may call it X or Y or Z, it may be male or female, but surely there's some unity underlying it all. I think what he was doing metaphysically was the equivalent of discovering oxygen. Everybody on the world is breathing, and we're using breath to speak words. But without oxygen, nothing is going to happen here. We'll all be dead. So we need. There's got to be a religious equivalent to the oxygen that gives everybody life, right? And I think that's what I call esoteric monotheism. There is an energy at the heart of all traditions which gives life, and which is life itself. And I think that's what Abraham realised. And I think he passed that on verbally, orally, to his family, his friends, his descendants. And I think that is authentic esoteric monotheism. In the Jewish tradition, that's come down as the Kabbalah, which is the oral explanation. When it was written in the Bible, I think they jumbled it up a bit, and they got carried away, these priests attached to the temple, and they made it far more strict and bloodthirsty than it should have been. There's a brilliant book I recommend to everybody if you want to understand the Bible. It's called just been reading this in the last couple of days. It's called something like "How many people did God kill in the Bible?" ? It's a sort of it's not a joke. It's some chap has gone through the entire Bible and counted up every time God smotes or smites an enemy, and he's listed them all. It's a 300-page book, right? You can get it, you can read most of it online. And the total number is something like 2.8 million God deliberately kills during the course of the Bible. And he gives all the reasons, like, looking in the wrong way, or going in the wrong direction, or not paying enough taxes, or they're all pretty arbitrary reasons. And God does an awful lot of smiting. And this guy who writes it, who is an atheist, says, like, what? And we're worshipping this God? And I recommend everybody to read this book. The guy's done some amazing research. Now, I think what we can affirm is that the Bible text, when it was written down by people who were afraid, and they were trying to create a sort of religious text that would fill people with fear, so they'd come to the temple and pay them taxes. Like I say, it's an old scam, and I think that that's what I call vulgar monotheism. It is quite vulgar, and it leads to lots of terror and fear by people. The esoteric monotheism, you can't really write it down. And that's what the true rabbis, the true sages, have been trying to do in parallel to this vulgar monotheism within Judaism. They've been trying to kind of discipline their vulgar monotheist friends who are still rampaging around saying, let's kill all the Palestinians, let's kill those horrible Christians. They're still wanting to do slaying in the name of their God, because they are reading the Bible as giving them the authority to do that. Because the others, the enemy, God wants to kill off, right? And you can find loads of quotes in the Bible where God will say, go and kill them. They're not proper people. Well, I don't believe in that kind of a God. And I don't think that esoteric monotheism can endorse that kind of ignorance. It's ignorance. So I think that authentic Judaism, to me, is the secret voice of the Kabbalistic tradition, which is authentic esoteric monotheism, and which is affirming of life and is affirming of nature, and the fecundity and beauty of nature. So that the Shintoists that I've met, I've known a few Shintoists, and the Kabbalists that I've met, right, and you can be a Kabbalist and still an Orthodox Jew, right? It depends on how you define orthodoxy, which means going straight to the truth. I'd say I'm a very orthodox philosopher in the Aristotelian sense of going straight to the truth. Aristotle is the first philosopher to use this term, orthodox, and it means orthos, doxa, straight to truth. Well, I'm extremely orthodoxa, but I'm what I call meta-orthodox. So I believe in the practice simultaneously with the orthodoxy within all the traditions, which is the meta-Mahayana perspective. Now I think that the really interesting and impressive rabbis I've met, like Rabbi Friedlander, Rabbi Hugo Grin, who was in Auschwitz but survived, and others, they would understand what I'm saying. They would say, no, the vulgar monotheistic Bible God who does all the slaying, that's not the real God that a Jew should worship. The real God is the one that we can extract from those texts and apply a radical hermeneutic interpretation based on love and compassion and wisdom, and reclaim those texts for all humanity. Just as the Shintoists have to do, because in some of their texts, there's some pretty arbitrary killing going on as well. So anyway, I think it's an unfortunate fact that during World War II, the Japanese sided with Hitler, who was setting out to destroy all the Jews of Europe and kill loads of them and massacred them, and as well as looking for Freemasons, he was always invading places and rounding up all the Jews and having them killed. I mean, he was a pathological, crazy guy for all kinds of complex psychological reasons. And it's a tragedy to me that the Japanese went along with it and allied to him. So there's some healing to be done in the relationship between the Jewish people as a whole and the Japanese. But I think that's now, there are modern day Japanese philosophers and samols that understand what I'm saying about the real wisdom within Judaism is as pristine and as beautiful as that within authentic Shintoism. But both traditions had their crazy, bloodthirsty types who had the view that we're the best. You know, Japanese guys saying, we're the best, we're the only. Come to our temples. And just like some of the Jews have been saying, you know, trying to delegitimize the rights of Palestinians to be Muslims or Christians and still live in the Holy Land. So I think we as a humanity need to transcend that vulgar monotheism, as I call it, and that only my way type of attitude. The best way I think we can do that, if you're into scholarship, is to dive into the esoteric monotheism, which is existing in all the traditions. And by the way, it goes back largely also to ancient Egypt. And I think that's what Moses was schooled in. Moses was a few generations after Abraham, and I think he realised, because he'd been trained in the Egyptian schools, that it hit him like a thunderbolt. Oh my God, that wisdom I've learned in Egypt, and that wisdom these weird desert people that say I'm related to them and Abraham, it's the same wisdom. God, there's really one God then. You know, I think it was an enlightenment experience for him. And I think, again, he handed that down through the Kabbalistic lineages. But in the Bible, if you read about Moses, he's a pretty horrible guy. He's always smiting the wrong kind of people. And I don't believe in that. I think that's a later projection back in time by the sort of nasty temple priesthoods who wanted to claim a monopoly of truth. I think truth is so awesome and amazing, I don't think anyone can have a monopoly of it. And that's why I designed this periodic table, to get that message out. It's just so awesome, it should belong to everyone, you know. Okay, is that all right?
Amazing.
That explains that one, yeah? It's interesting, isn't it, as a tool, a sort of hermeneutic tool.
Impressive.
It is pretty awesome, yeah. Okay, well maybe next week we'll do another 6, but hopefully that gives people an idea of how to use the tool.
Thank you, Professor.
No, thank you now for asking the questions. Great.